For my thoughts on all the latest happenings in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, be sure to check out my channel, JG9 News. And now, on with our feature presentation. Back in 1985, the Orange Bowl was a fortress for the Miami Dolphins, as it seemed like they could do no wrong. The writing was on the wall for the venue, as the Dolphins were going to move into their brand new facility, Joe Robbie Stadium, for the 1987 season. And the Dolphins were trying their absolute best to make sure that their final days of the Orange Bowl before they made the move were memorable and full of wins. Winning at the Orange Bowl in the mid-80s was like trying to invade Russia during the wintertime, or like trying to beat Michael Jordan one-on-one in a pickup basketball game. Odds are, it's not going to end well for you. And the 1985 season was a perfect example of that for Miami, as in 1985, the Dolphins won the AFC East and finished with the best record in the conference by going 12-4, with 8 of those 12 wins coming at home. They were undefeated during the regular season when playing at home, including their iconic demolition against the then undefeated and vaunted Chicago Bears in one of the most iconic moments in Monday Night Football history. And you can learn more about one of their home wins during that 1985 campaign by clicking the card in the upper right corner. To illustrate how good Miami was at home, from the second half of the 1983 season, so when Dan Marino really started to get going, until the opening home game of the 1986 season, the Dolphins played 22 regular season home games, and won 21 of them, winning a staggeringly high 96% of the time. If you went to a Dolphins game back in the mid-80s, it was practically a guarantee that you were going to see the Dolphins win. In fact, the Dolphins were so good at protecting their home fort in the Orange Bowl, even if their home fort didn't protect them. Because during this game right here, in the middle of that 1985 campaign, a game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the Orange Bowl, the stadium literally collapsed in the middle of the game. No, I am not kidding or exaggerating. During the climax of the game, as the Dolphins were trying to come away with the victory, some fans weren't fearing the outcome of the game, but rather were fearing for their lives as concrete came crashing down. Because this is the story behind the time, in the middle of a game, mind you, that the Orange Bowl collapsed. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context to understand the importance of this scheme, as well as how the game was going and what was happening in the game that led to a part of the stadium collapsing, because oddly enough, if it wasn't for the game being as good and as competitive as it was, this never happens. It's October 20th, 1985. It's week 7 of the NFL season, and we've got a Floridian battle between the only 2 teams in the state at the time, the Miami Dolphins and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. For the Buccaneers, this game meant just about nothing. They were arguably the worst team in football at this point, starting the year with an 0-6 record and having nothing to play for but pride. For the Dolphins, however, they were 4-2, needing to win this game against a super beatable opponent in order to keep pace in the AFC playoff picture. The New York Jets were leading the AFC East with a 5-1 record, and even though 4-2 is good, the Dolphins were one of 9 teams at or above 500 through 6 weeks in the ultra-competitive AFC, at a time where only 5 teams in each conference made the playoffs. The Dolphins entered this game as huge 13-point favorites, so if they did what everyone expected them to do, they would be in an amazing spot at 5-2, and barring a collapse, should be able to make it into the playoffs for the 5th straight season. Lose this game though, and things get a bit dicey. Having said that, when it came to this game, there were 2 things that no one saw coming. We'll get to the second one in just a bit, but the first one was just how close this would be. I don't think anyone in their right mind saw the 0-6 Tampa Bay Buccaneers going down to the Orange Bowl, where the Dolphins were just about invincible and had maybe the best quarterback in the game in Dan Marino, and putting up a fight. Especially when the Dolphins led it 14-0 after the first quarter, 24-7 near the end of the first half, and 38-21 at the end of the third quarter. This had all the makings of a complete and utter blowout. However, to Tampa's credit, they showed incredible resiliency. They did not go down without a fight, and what we ended up getting was arguably one of the greatest regular season games of the entire 1980s. And I do not say that lightly, because thanks to 4 touchdown passes by Steve DeBerg, with all 4 of them going to tight end Jimmy Giles in what might have been, at the time, the greatest receiving performance by any player in a losing effort, the Bucs were able to claw their way back into the game by scoring 17 straight points in the fourth quarter to tie it at 38 apiece. Unfortunately for Tampa, as you can tell from these highlights, the game didn't quite work out in their favor, as Miami drove quickly down the field after that and won the game on a 43-yard field goal with virtually no time left, taking it by a final score of 41-38. But the Bucs gave Miami a pretty good scare and put up one heck of a fight despite the loss. Speaking of scares though, this game provided something else that no one saw coming, because the Bucs' shocking comeback led to fans actually being active in the fourth quarter. Let's assume there's 2 minutes left in the contest, and the Bucs have the ball on offense, and they're down by 17 points. Are you going to be that invested if you're a fan? Probably not. Are you going to exude energy stomping your feet and making noise with your team on defense? Maybe, but you won't be as loud as you would be in a tie game. That's just how human psychology and fandom work. There's a reason why Duke fans are more invested during a game against UNC than a game against a buy-in opponent. It's like how you're invested in a baseball game when it's tied in the bottom of the ninth versus when it's 8-0 and there's no one on base. So let's make it very clear. If the Buccaneers did not come back and give Miami their potential first home loss of the season, and just their second in the last 24 months in the regular season, none of what's about to transpire in this story actually goes down. The Buccaneers were painful in 1985, and even in the rare moments where they were good, as you're about to find out, they were painful. Because with 53 seconds left in the contest, the Bucs were trailing by 3 points and were at the 21-yard line facing 3rd and 5. The situation is simple. If the Bucs get a first down, not only do they extend the drive and get into the red zone, potentially winning the game in the process, but in the absolute worst case scenario, they can run out the clock and make it so that Miami never touches the ball again in regulation. And depending on how the coin flip in the overtime period goes, make it so that Miami never touches the ball again, period. If the Bucs don't get a first down, they have to settle for 3 points, and Miami gets the ball back. This is, simply put, the biggest play of the game. Now, as you can tell right here, DeBerg's pass for Giles falls incomplete, and it brings up 4th down, with the Dolphins still leading 38-35, meaning that Miami's defense somehow did its job, and the Dolphins will get one final chance in regulation to get it back. But what happens on 3rd down in the 4th quarter of a 3-point game? You've got chants saying defense, defense. You've got everyone up on their feet. You've got people making as much noise as possible to try and force the offense out of rhythm, to try and prevent the offense from making audibles, to try and prevent the offensive players from hearing each other, or to bait the offense into a false start penalty, which would have been huge in this case, because it would have made the field goal less of a chip shot if the 3rd down was not converted. And when you've got a sold-out Orange Bowl in a spot like this, especially in a battle for bragging rights in the state, it's gonna be really loud. Listen to the crowd and how loud it was.
For the Dolphins, slot formation left. The crowd alive.
You hear fans chanting, you hear fans screaming, you hear fans clapping, and you hear fans stomping their feet. And therein lies the problem, because guess what happened at one section of the aging venue when fans started to stomp their feet? That's right, the floor completely collapsed, and they were sitting on air essentially, because in the upper deck, at section 20, on the north side of the stadium, at this exact moment, The fans, through no fault of their own, caused the venue to completely collapse. Rich Flincham was a Dolphin fan who was sitting in that section and in the row where the concrete collapsed, which was row 2, and that was where disaster struck. Because due to the fans stomping their feet like fans do during these moments, a huge chunk of concrete on the floor fell out of the upper deck and to the lower deck. Said Flincham, "We were pounding our feet, and all of a sudden, our feet went through. The people below were looking up to see what hit them." Yep, that's right. The concrete literally hit fans in the lower level. You go to a football game expecting to walk away with your team winning, and you end up leaving it walking away with a giant piece of concrete hitting you. Said another fan in that section of the stadium, all of a sudden, a couple people started jumping around and started screaming. I thought someone brought a snake in there. They put their feet through the floor. When you can see through the floor of a concrete stadium, you really get shook. The situation was so bad that people had to clear a portion of that section of the stadium, moving fans somewhere else for obvious safety reasons. And just to give you an idea of what the aftermath was like, here's one photo of the wreckage. No exaggeration, there was no floor. These people literally did not have a place to put their feet, because the concrete was completely gone and had fallen into the lower level of the stadium. Amazingly enough, and I cannot believe this, no one got injured. Despite a giant piece of concrete falling from the stadium at high speeds, not a single person got hurt or died in the aftermath, which is why this is probably the first time you're hearing about this story 40 years later. Somehow, the concrete fell to the one part of the stadium where no one was sitting, as it happened to fall into an aisle, and no one was walking up or down the aisle because no one in their right mind would leave a game on third down with their team up by 3 points with 50 seconds left. By some stroke of luck, this did not turn out to be a complete disaster. If this was any other part of the stadium, or if this game was a blowout where people were exiting their seats, or if the Dolphins had the ball at this point and could just take a knee and fans were filing out, or if one person just really had to go to the bathroom, people legitimately could have died. The only way for no one to die during this or to get hurt during this was for the concrete to miss the seats and hit the aisle, and for it to hit the aisle during a time where no sane person would even be in the aisle. And if the stadium had to collapse on itself in the middle of the game, it picked the best possible time to do it. But as one Dolphin fan by the name of John Bellows said, who witnessed the incident and decided to evacuate from Section 20, even though he was not escorted by police, I went down to the lower stands and took another seat. I didn't want a piece of concrete falling on my head. I have season tickets, and I'm not so sure I want to sit there anymore. And I mean, I can't blame the guy. I'm not sure I'd want season tickets in a section that is literally falling apart, where all I have to do is put my foot down, and the floor could cave in. So, what was the issue? Well, in 1979, there were a ton of hairline cracks in the upper deck, and Orange Bowl officials realized that this could be a problem someday, and that this probably wasn't safe. You don't want a stadium floor, especially for a game like the one you've been watching this whole time, that looks like it could fall apart at any minute. So the officials replaced the slabs of the upper deck with new ones. The upper deck was built in 1948, so the floor lasted about 3 decades, and everything was good to go after the replacement slabs were put in. However, for some reason, they replaced every slab in the upper deck except for, you guessed it, the one in Section 20, as in, the one that was built in 1948. Somehow, every other slab got replaced and was relatively new, being about half a decade old, except for the Section 20 slab, which was nearing 4 decades old and which they somehow passed over. What's the worst that can happen? Well, sure enough, that's the worst that can happen. The floor of Section 20 ceases to exist. the concrete falls onto the lower deck below, and people could get injured or die, which I'm genuinely amazed that nothing happened. And everything seemed to be okay after that. An independent engineering firm was hired just to make sure the stadium was safe and that this was an isolated incident. The slab in Section 20 that hadn't been replaced since the upper deck of the Orange Bowl was built in 1948 got replaced, and no games got moved or postponed, and the stadium was fully operational for Saturday's collegiate game between the University of Miami and Louisville. If there was going to be a best-case scenario, somehow, the Orange Bowl found it. Although the mayor of Miami said it best when he said on the concrete issue, "I'm very worried about that. If a piece of concrete that size falls and hits someone, it could kill them." Let's just say that there were wars less dangerous that had fewer casualties than the Orange Bowl had in 1985. Of course, you had the incident during the game between these two teams behind me right here. But on the collegiate side of things, you also had the 1985 Orange Bowl, which you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. That was a disaster that injured fans and where everything kind of fell apart. The halftime show for that Orange Bowl was a salute to Charlie Brown and the Peanuts comic strip. And it did not go according to plan, I'll put it that way. The fireworks were supposed to go off vertically, but instead, one of them went off horizontally, meaning that the firework landed in the crowd and injured people. If you had a ticket to a game at the Orange Bowl in 1985, there was a pretty decent chance that you were going to wind up in the hospital too. This game right here between the Miami Dolphins and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers is known 4 decades later for being an unbelievable regular season game, for being a great back and forth affair, for being one of the greatest almost comebacks of all time, for almost being one of the greatest upsets of all time, and for being another classic Dan Marino finish and offensive showing. But we're lucky that the game is remembered today for that, and not for what happened off the field and in the stands, where the stadium literally collapsed in the middle of the game because the Buccaneers were playing too well, and where by some stroke of luck and divine intervention, not a single fan got hurt or died. It's the forgotten version of the plane crash at Memorial Stadium in Baltimore during the Colts-Steelers playoff game, where only one specific, highly unlikely scenario would have led to no one in the stands getting hurt or dying, and that scenario happened. That same thing applied for that Dolphins-Bucks game. Because on this day in 1985, while the outcome of the game at the end was concrete, the stadium was literally anything but. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.